Hello, welcome to this Integrated Skills Wider Waste webinar series. Today we're joined by Victoria Murray from Eunomia. And Victoria, we're going to be picking up on a conversation we actually started 5 years ago this week. I don't know if you remember that. Nice to see you, but thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. No, it's great to see you. In the meantime, I think this is the fourth time you've actually done a presentation on the government's resources and waste strategy. I remember those heady days when I think it was on the third week of January in 2019, and I think we were quite upbeat about the government's resources and waste strategy at the time, thinking this is actually not bad, there's some quite good stuff in here. And I think we've been slightly ground down with time over the period, but it's good to see that actually there've been some advances and we've got something we can talk about in this webinar, and there's definitely some events and some information to be passing on and talking about during the webinar. So yeah, thanks very much for agreeing to do this again.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, and thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you signing up for the webinar. We should be running about 45 minutes if everything goes according to plan, maybe longer if we have some active Q&A. Get ready for that, Victoria. Let me just start with a few slides, bit of housekeeping. Let me just go through a couple of things. Let me just introduce myself, Stuart Henshaw. I'm Business Development Director at the company called Integrated Skills. Many of you will know us already. Many of you are our current clients, but and there's also some new faces on the list of people joining the webinar today. A little bit about Integrated Skills. What do we do? We've got over 100 UK local authority clients, many of them using our software, our route optimization software, RouteSmart. Used by lots of utilities across the UK, and it's actually used in a range of services, but mainly and specifically for this this purpose and this webinar series for waste management, streets, winter maintenance, and gullies. We have an in-cab back office solution, Navigator and Fusion, and actually we just launched our Smart Suite, our next gen in-cab back office system. Around about 36% of the UK is covered by authorities who have either used our consultancy services for route optimization, or they have the software themselves. And this is my particular kind of hobby at the moment, is actually just promoting our next gen solution for in-cab and back office trade waste and jobs management. We're pretty excited about that, but that's a discussion for another day. I wanted just to update you on some events that I'm going to, and I'll be at. If any of you are at, they're really good to meet up. But on the 8th of Feb, I'll be at the APSI Street Cleansing Seminar. We're exhibiting there, and the theme of that is Street Cleansing Services for the Future. And then on the 29th of February, the follow-up to this webinar is a webinar on efficient and effective food waste routes, best practice. And we'll be discussing with Mark Mohan from Newcastle City Council and my colleagues James Baker and Andy Clues, really what the people need to be thinking about when they're looking at building or planning for efficient and effective food waste routes. And no doubt you're all focused on that now. Now the government's capital funding at least has been announced for the food waste initiative. On the 7th of March, I'll be down at the National Food Waste Conference. If any of you are there, that would be nice to meet up. And then on the 8th of May, any of you up in Scotland, we'll be exhibiting at Larach in Scotland. Just a little bit about today. The idea is we're making this as informal as possible, although today, we're going to be hearing quite a lot of information from Victoria. She's put together some really quite thorough and detailed slides. So some of it will be actually just listening to Victoria, but please use the information, the chat pod at the bottom, to ask your questions as you go along. There'll also be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. But before we start any of that, I would like to kick off with a little survey and just to see what your thoughts are on this question. How would you rate your level of understanding of the current status of the government's resource and waste simpler recycling strategy? very high. That's for anyone that really ought to be running this webinar. High, medium, low, or very low. I wouldn't be surprised if anyone said it very low. I think it's been quite a wrestle actually keeping up with the progress on this legislation, particularly since the 7 bins scenario was shelved. That was one of my personal hates, was the 7 bin scenario that never was. Okay, we're going to close that in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end that now and share the results. Okay, there we go. 74% of you have actually responded. Thank you. With, you know, most people feeling they've got a high or medium or high level of understanding of the status of the strategy. So yeah, it's quite an encouraging situation, Victoria. So at this stage, I'm going to hand over to you to actually take us through your slides. So let's I'll hand over to you, and the mouse is yours.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so I've got a brief slide on who Eunomia are. So we're a independent environmental consultancy and basically focused on all things environment, so climate, nature, energy, and materials, and also with a look at social value and how that feeds into those. Essentially, we're looking forward to building a sustainable future, and we're separated into different kind of areas in terms of the support we provide. So a lot of support to local government and their service providers. We also help develop policy with national and international governments, and then we work with other agencies and charities, NGOs and businesses. And we've got 150 consultants based in the UK and further abroad, including in America and Brussels and other places. So that's a little bit about us. And then so I'm going to run through kind of what we know about simpler recycling and some of the interfaces with other policy changes, and in particular EPR, because that's another sort of critical thing that's affecting local authorities. So I've put the little caption there from DEFRA's consultation paper that was published, sort of the response, and saying that this is a new common sense approach, I think, alluding to the 7 bins there, with the aim of putting an end to the confusion around what can and can't be recycled in different parts of the country. So what is the government looking to achieve? So essentially the headlines from this are that we know that we'll have to collect food waste by the end of March 2026. There'll also be the requirement to collect an increased range of dry recyclables, and I've actually got a following slide that sets out more detail about what materials that includes within each of the broad categories that are stated there. We've obviously got plastic film from the end of March 2027. Garden waste collections, however, they may still be chargeable, and you can also still co-collect garden waste and food waste, provided that it's on a weekly frequency. And they've also stated in the current drafting, at least, that the minimum frequency for residual waste collection will be fortnightly. However, the document does state that the preference is for a weekly collection, which sort of harks back to previous Conservative government policies around weekly residual waste collection, if we think back to the days of Eric Pickles.
I remember it well.
Yeah. So we thought it would be quite useful to include a more detailed slide on the different materials that need to be collected as part of the simpler recycling policy change. So glass and metals, fairly straightforward, although we've got within the metals, aerosols and aluminium foil have been included, as well as food trays and the lids off pots and aluminium tubes. So there's probably a few, I suppose, more niche materials that aren't currently collected by quite a number of authorities. The plastics, I'm not going to read all of those out. You can look at those in your free time. But a huge number of different material types, essentially, that make up plastic bottles, pots, tubs and trays. And then from the 31st of March 2027, it will also then include the films as well. And then paper and card, I think rather than trying to state all of the materials this does contain, they've taken the opposite point of view and stated what it doesn't, for ease of understanding, I think. But it's the usual things that most local authorities have listed as prohibited within their range of materials because they're difficult to process and generally aren't accepted by the market, but things that are laminated, glitter, sticky, padded envelopes, that kind of thing. So sort of looking at the composite products that include paper. And then the final grouping, which is actually included within the plastics recyclable stream, and that's cartons, food and drinks cartons, Tetra Paks, and so on. So you might have seen a timeline in various guises at other conferences if you've been attending any of those on the topic, but I thought it would be useful just to include one here with some of the more recent updates. So we know that we've now had the capital new burdens funding that's been announced. So authorities have now had their letters stating how much capital funding they will get for food waste. And then at some point this year, although a specific date hasn't been indicated yet, the ongoing revenue kind of funding for delivering that will be provided to local authorities. And then by the end of this year, the current plan timetable, local authorities should know what their EPR funding will be based on the modelled costs that DEFRA are putting together. And then we've got some things coming in next year around the business waste compliance, and then I've just realised those two are the wrong way around, so I have to fix that. And then deposit return scheme coming in later in that year, and then that takes us up to households coming in 26, and then films as the additional material in 2027. So now I think we're going to have another poll.
Jump in there. How satisfied are you with the new burdens funding? Some of you have already got involved in this. Does it provide all you need? Provides slightly less than we need, provides much less than we need. Okay, so we've got 18% of you are saying actually it provides much less than we need, and that it's quite an interesting one, Victoria, because we I know we've both discussed this with a number of authorities, and that seems to be the kind of indication that this is not only going to provide less funding than is actually needed, but it's actually some of it is significantly less, and perhaps the calculation, perhaps the formula was a little bit out of date. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Oh, it looks like they can't vote at the moment, so maybe we need to.
Okay. Just a second.
Oh, that's interesting there.
Modelled
34 and got funding for 26. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I think the fund it's actually I think it's not letting me activate the voting. Sorry, I think people have already voted for this one.
Okay.
So I think that's interesting though that you know there's no one saying it provides them with all they need.
No.
I'll pass back to you.
Thanks. Okay, so this is just a bit more detail on what's being proposed. We've got consistent collections of food waste, which we know the minimum standard for that is weekly, and the minimum requirements for dry recycling in terms of the materials that will be required to be collected from the curbside, although the government has said that there will be no mandated specific way of collecting those materials. Then we've got the minimum fortnightly frequency for residual waste, although I know there's been some pushback, particularly from organisations such as LARAC, who act on behalf of local authorities, and they essentially, in their response to the consultation, were saying that they didn't feel that, you know, having to revert back from a 3 or 4 weekly collection system for those who've introduced them was particularly workable, and also that lots of authorities are currently looking at that as an option. to drive up recycling performance and to get those last materials, particularly materials that require more cleaning potentially by the resident before they're putting them in the recycling. One way to do that is to significantly restrict capacity.
Do we know anything about that consultation outcome, Victoria, when that's due?
No, not as yet. It was only open for a very short window, so it didn't give people a huge amount of time to put forward their views. So it'll be interesting to see what the results are of that when it is published.
Yeah.
There'll also be no new burdens funding for collecting any of the additional recycling streams. There's been a comment that this is expected to be covered by EPR, but obviously all of those materials within scope may not be packaging waste in the scope of EPR. So that's quite an interesting viewpoint. And then also there'll be no funding for if the government sticks with the 2 weekly, there'll be no funding available for moving back to a weekly or fortnightly collection of residual waste. So that potentially causes a bit of a problem for some authorities that have made that change already and have then to find the budgets to increase the frequency, do the rerouting, and also recruit the staff and communicate that back to residents. So that's a challenge.
That's particularly difficult when authorities have been doing their consultations with residents actually, and they've implemented a 3 or 4 weekly collections and argued why it's important to do that, and then to have to sort of backtrack is very complex, isn't it? Very difficult.
Yeah. And then in addition, it looks likely that there'll be no capital lump sum funding expected under EPR. So essentially, you'll get a modelled cost for your service for the packaging element of the waste that you collect for a service that's efficient and effective will be calculated, and then you'll be presented with a number. Presumably that would be paid per tonne, but we're not quite sure yet. It could be per annum, per authority. We don't know how that funding will be specifically set out for each authority. But if you need to buy new vehicles or new assets in order to deliver the full range of materials under simpler recycling and EPR, it's not going to be like new burdens funding where you get a lump sum to help you establish that service. So, for example, if you don't currently collect glass, you'll just have to find the means of doing that by 2026. And as we just discussed, the indicative capital new burdens funding was sent to local authorities on the 9th of January. And it was, there's an interesting point there on the chat that there was no reference made to garden waste within the letters sent out to local authorities, although it was referred to in the simpler recycling published response. It hasn't been referred to in the letters. So I don't know if the view is from DEFRA that most authorities will move to having an AD treatment for food waste and a windrow treatment for garden, and therefore want to keep those separate in order to charge for the garden waste potentially in the future, or whether it's something that's been overlooked in the modelling.
Yes. Interesting.
So what's outstanding? Some clarity, I think, is probably the fundamental things. So one thing that we haven't touched on yet is packaging recycling targets. So these are kind of set as a whole for sort of what the government wants to achieve in terms of a percentage of the packaging waste placed on the market. And essentially, those targets were set against the original timeframe for these policy changes, and they haven't been revised downwards to account for the delay in what was consistent collections, but is now being referred to as simpler recycling. So essentially, some of those materials that are included within simpler recycling, and the anticipation was that they would be within the recycling waste stream. For some authorities, they won't actually be collected at the curbside as yet. So that's an interesting view there. because it's not required until 2026, except for the film, but the targets will apply in theory from 2024, or these new proposed targets will apply from 2024.
So how that shortfall's met, either the targets are changed or I don't
know.
They're ignored, maybe.
Yeah, and then if you have to revert back to a high frequency of residual waste collection, there's a question of whether that may result in less packaging or less recycling, which would include packaging, being collected at the curbside, because people have the option to put materials in the residual waste. There isn't such an incentive for them to put the materials in the recycling stream. And the obligation to meet these targets will be placed on the producers who are placing the packaging on the market. However, how that will be managed, what the penalties are for failing to achieve the targets, who will monitor it, and so on, is something that's not yet clear, because that's some of the detail that hasn't come out yet. But there has been talk of it being a single scheme administrator who would oversee that. But so it's sort of how a failure to meet that target would be then passed back to individual producers and how they might be liable is not at all clear. And whether the targets are an ambition at this stage rather than something that will be binding and have a potentially financial consequence.
Yeah, interesting. Question from David relating to the timeline slide. Can anyone see the timeline being kept to in all areas? If you take the performance to date, one of the challenges for us all actually just to work out what's actually happening is the fact that some of these measures have go live dates and then are just sort of put back. So it's a bit of a difficult one to imagine that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a few things there. I think one is that in the producer side of the EPR coin, if you like, there's still a lot of uncertainty and the awareness isn't as high as it should be. So there's a question of whether the market will be ready to meet this. I think the other big challenge around simpler recycling and getting that implemented as a local authority is that if you look at the kind of the scale of change that's required in terms of the number of authorities that currently collect food waste and the numbers of authorities that don't as yet, or they offer a scheme but it's only to a proportion of residents, because we know that lots of authorities may not have fully rolled out systems to communal properties, for example, because of the challenges those types of properties present, is that we're going to need the vehicle market to supply a huge number of vehicles within a very short period of time for that type of market. In recent years, we've seen some quite considerable delays in vehicle lead times due to other factors. But the question is, has there been any real market analysis in terms of engaging with those vehicle suppliers to say whether or not we can actually meet the demand as a whole in terms of providing those vehicles in time for people to implement the services? And I think that's a concern. And then linked to that is the capacity. There may be an overall capacity for anaerobic digestion if you take it from a place of looking at the permitted capacity as a whole for the whole of the UK. But I think if you started looking at it region by region and also looked at what the technical capacity is compared to the permitted capacity, because quite often the sites don't run at their limit for various reasons, is, do we have enough capacity at the moment? Because some of the players in the market are nervous about investment. I mean, Veolia made a statement yesterday that the delays in policy are affecting their appetite to invest, not necessarily in food waste, because that's not their typical area, but in terms of just investing generally in the UK, is being hampered by, the delays in these decisions and the uncertainties. So I imagine lots of the other kind of big players in the market are, having the same challenges and thinking the same. So
yes,
yeah, that's quite
interesting. On that same theme of actually rolling out schemes to say communal where it doesn't exist at the moment, Adam's raised an interesting question which kind of fits into the efficiency and effectiveness test. He's talking about if you've got a very rural area, actually, are there going to be is there going to be a requirement to actually roll out simpler recycling or food waste to each of these properties, or are there going to be any kind of exemptions for that? I don't know. I've not seen anything on that. I don't know if you've seen anything on that.
Food waste, they've been very clear that it will be all properties and it will be weekly as a minimum frequency. So, and residual waste is fortnightly. So those are two where they've been very clear that those are the frequencies. On recycling collections, we do have quite a range of frequencies of collection for different types of materials. For example, some of the ones that collect 3 weekly residual do 3 weekly recycling as well. So there may be some scope, provided that you can achieve the efficient and effective effectiveness of your system in order to meet the EPR funding, then there might be scope to offer something slightly different, but I think it would have to be, at this stage anyway, a curbside collection service. And then the difficulty is, which we come on to a little bit later, is this balance between meeting the requirements of simpler recycling and being compliant, but then does that mean your service is efficient and effective or not? And if it's not, what then? What happens then?
Yeah, quite.
Yeah, you make a point there about just in the chat there about garden waste, offering a service to people who don't have gardens.
Karen's saying 70 houses in the City of London. Interesting challenge, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
How many vehicles is that? How many required there? A part of one. Interesting.
Yeah.
Some sort of point again from just reiterating from Adam about doing 6 miles per gallon. You could argue, is that efficiently and effective? That's true.
I think, well, if it's food waste, it sits outside of the test of efficient and effective.
Yeah.
It's a statutory requirement because it's actually specified at a minimum frequency within the environment.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Whereas for other materials, it doesn't go into that granularity of detail. So carrying on with kind of what's outstanding. So there seems to be a tension, as I've just kind of alluded to there, between compliance with simpler recycling and achieving your maximum funding under EPR. So could you get into a situation where the cost of implementing an improvement plan, if you're not efficient and effective, is greater than the reduction you would receive in funding? And then if you get into that, so essentially if your tested service is either ineffective or inefficient, you will be given an improvement plan with a reasonable time period to rectify that, whatever the reason for your improvement is needed, for whatever reason they've identified you need to improve. And then if you don't meet that within the timescales, you could then be subject to a reduction in your EPR funding as a kind of a penalty for failing to meet an efficient and effective service. However, if the cost of you making that change is very significant and the reduction in your EPR funding is less than that, is there a situation where you could be forced as an authority to take that hit because the cost of the alternative is just too great? It might be that you're in an urban authority, you've got very high transient population, high turnover of residents, you could have language barriers, and therefore you do lots, even if you do lots of communications, you might find it's not enough to get you above a certain level of recycling performance, or you've got very high levels of contamination and rejected loads. And then in that situation, doing more and getting up to what's efficient and effective might be quite difficult. However, it's important to note that in DEFRA's measurement of what's efficient and effective, you will be compared to authorities that are similar to you in nature. So it's not like they're going to take a an urban authority and then compare it to a shire district that's very affluent and then expect them to achieve the same standards of performance, because that won't be the case. There's also potential for a bit of tension between two-tier authorities. We already have a little bit of tension between them anyway in certain the handling of certain materials. So with recycling, obviously the statutory duty to dispose and treat of that can be passed to the collection authority. So the collection authority could have the contract to deal with the recycling. And then there's a question mark about when EPR funding comes in, what role, I've completely forgotten what they're called. My mind has gone blank. I'll come back to it.
Okay.
The words have disappeared from my mind. So, and again, if you're switching to a greater frequency of residual waste collections, there's a potential that could mean that you capture less recycling, particularly if you had 3 weekly before and then you start to capture less. Does that mean you're more efficient, you're less efficient and effective than when the baseline measurement was taken? And also, what could be put in the improvement plan? Are we saying, everyone's got to have a 140? Do you have to roll out extensive communications? And in doing so, the EPR funding, in theory, should be paying for that, for the packaging element of those materials. Recycling credits, that's what I meant. What the role of recycling credits might have in the future when, in theory, EPR should cover the bulk of materials, the packaging materials. So will EPR just be left to cover newspapers and, other non-packaging wastes or recyclables? We did touch on the move to weekly collections. If you've got a combined food and garden waste service at the moment, that I would have to move to weekly. Although they have said you can suspend the garden waste element of that service in the winter, when presumably you'll have less garden waste. But generally where you do that, then the food waste participation falls off as well, because people don't like the messy factor of putting tiny bits of food waste in a large container that has nothing else in it. And essentially for devolved nations, the EPR payment will have to cover those additional requirements or different requirements that they might have. So, for example, in Wales, they've got their blueprint, which sets out curbside sort as a preferred collection system, and EPR would need to, in those areas, pay for that system. Another sort of outstanding question is around the business waste service element. So there'll be some local authorities who collect or operate a trade waste service, and the requirements for that come in a year earlier. So if you've got a co-collected service, that might introduce some challenges for you, having to roll out these additional materials to businesses before households. And then also what's not clear is how that's, as a whole, how the business waste element of this equation will be enforced and policed. So will that fall to local authorities in a sort of duty of care type role? Will DEFRA be looking after that, or the scheme administrator? Who's actually going to make sure that businesses are, complying with simpler recycling from a collection perspective? And also, as I touched on earlier, how the market might meet the vehicle and infrastructure needs to implement these changes within the timescales that we've been set.
Victoria, I've got a question, and I'm not sure the answer to it myself. Is the reduction in EPR funding capped at 80%? So Phil's suggesting, so the incentive to improve isn't actually that big. I don't know the answer to that, do you?
No, I'm not sure. We can go away and double check.
Yep, we can come back on that, Phil.
Yeah, what the proposals are for that. But yeah, that potentially could be the case. And I think that's the point we're kind of making, is that this is sort of been badged as, transformative for the sector in terms of performance. But if you're an authority who, has got some significant challenges and barriers to achieving high performance, the costs might outweigh the benefits. And then, I don't know, do we just have some authorities that can't meet the required standard? I don't know. So I thought it would just be interesting to highlight this as a slight aside from simpler recycling, but an interesting view on the waste market as a whole, or the waste policy as a whole. So the Office for Environmental Protection has just published a report in the last week, I think, on how the government is progressing against achieving its natural environment targets. And within that, there's a chapter on waste management. And some of the key things that it draws out are that there are significant concerns about the effectiveness of the policies that we have in place at the moment, that there's misalignment between the scale and pace of these actions. And I think that goes back to the point that Stuart made when we started the call, that the very first webinar that him and I did on this subject was 5 years ago, and we still haven't implemented any of this. They were saying that actions to move waste up the waste hierarchy had largely proved to be ineffective. Policy measures that are in place at the moment are deemed to be insufficient. And then, yeah, there's just concern overall about the effectiveness of the measures to address waste crime. They also noted that there's been an increase in incineration over the last decade, and that this is now the primary municipal waste management method. And I think that's not really a surprise, because the UK has taken a big shift away from landfill as a treatment technology, or lack of technology, but as a treatment method, disposal method. But I've included there's a link there to the full report if anyone would like to read it. So what's next for simpler recycling? So authorities will be notified of their new burdens revenue funding at some point in 2024, although no specific date has been given as yet, and presumably we'll also see the outcome of the consultation on simpler recycling and some feedback on, I suppose, on the market's particular dislike of the ban on 3 weekly collections. There's an interesting sort of thought about how capital replacement programs will be funded going forward. So it looks like the new burdens funding will be a one-off, the capital element will be a one-off. And, you know, once those vehicles or other assets get to the end of life, then local authorities will have to find a means of funding those going forward. So there's a question whether, because EPR payments aren't ring-fenced, whether some local authorities would look to set aside some of that money into some sort of capital reserve in order to fund future replacements, or whether they just need to build that into future revenue planning if they're looking to borrow, you know, do prudential borrowing or get their contractor to borrow the money to pay for future replacement vehicles for food waste. There is no option to appeal new burdens funding, is what the government has stated throughout the process. So I think it's quite important that authorities try to understand those costs now, and it's clear from the feedback from the poll that for some authorities, you know, it is a shortfall from what they hoped. And then there's a question of, you know, how do we manage that? How does the market manage that? What are DEFRA's views on how that could be dealt with, or whether, because it's interesting from, you know, from the letter that it just says, please send us your bank details, not if you have concerns, please contact us, which I suppose sort of hints at the tone. And then we've also got the looming general election in autumn 2024, autumn this year. So
that could be significant, couldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, because these changes have been introduced as statutory guidance rather than change in law. Obviously, food waste is a change in law because that's in the Act. But a lot of these other changes are guidance and supplementary. So the question is whether that then leaves the door open for a future government to make amendments or remove entirely parts of the proposals. So that'd be very interesting to see how that plays out. And another point is that there's quite a high demand for options modelling within the market, and for authorities to try and understand what the consequences are and the timelines. So a sort of a message is, if you you know, if you need to look at options, get in there sooner rather than later, particularly if you're looking to buy a fleet of vehicles to provide the services. So what's next for EPR? I'm just conscious of time, so I'll try and whiz through this. So the government launched a WE collection consultation at the end of December, and that runs until the 7th of March. And this seems to be slightly more, or it seems to have taken the lessons learned from the consultations about the wider packaging EPR and sort of brought some of the difficult questions and proposals to an earlier phase of the consultation. So they've come out with some suggestions already around how it might work. But what they're trying to create is a partnership style arrangement between local authorities and producers, essentially to try and increase the amount of WE that's collected from households. And that's both sort of small electrical items, but also bigger, you know, domestic appliances and so on. So there's sort of 5 key things that came out of it, or that are put forward in the consultation. So looking at increasing free collections, which could be financed and led by producers. So essentially, it could be a producer working in partnership, or a group of producers working in partnership with local authorities to help improve the recovery of used WE. Introducing increasing distributor-led collection infrastructure. So this is sort of improving the take-back network, which sort of exists for some materials, but usually it's chargeable. It's often, you know, if you buy a new one, the replacement can go back, but just kind of improving access to that. New obligations around online marketplaces and fulfillment houses, because these sort of seem to have been a bit of a gap, and obviously the increase in sales through, or purchases through these routes, means that that's kind of a gap in or a potential issue for obligations if they become a greater share of the market. A new category for vapes, that's been a big concern, because I'm sure all of you see them littered everywhere, and to get some kind of responsibility from producers around the management and disposal of those. And then they're looking at having a WE scheme administrator with KPIs for managing and monitoring a future producer responsibility scheme. And then in terms of EPR funding, we said that should be notified in December 2024, subject to the outcome of the election and everything else following the timescales projected. Challenges. So we've touched on a few of these already, so I won't whiz through all of these, but I think, yeah, it's difficult. There's still lots of things that are uncertain. And there's also a question that what happens if all of these reforms come into place and then we still can't deliver the recycling targets, whether that's packaging recycling targets or the overall municipal recycling target, because obviously we didn't meet the 2020 recycling target. We were nearly there, but we didn't meet that target. And yeah, there's a question mark of, well, you know, we've got a much higher target of 65%. Is that really achievable? And then that's it from me. So I just wanted to say thank you. And yeah.
Thanks, Victoria. That's really great. I really appreciate the work and effort you've put into that. My polling tool at ground to a halt at the beginning there, I'm afraid. I wonder if everyone would be happy. I was thinking actually of circulating the questions and just actually getting your feedback on the number of questions we had, you know, about well, we actually managed to talk about your level of satisfaction with the new burdens funding, but then, you know, do you think your authority will be able to meet the targets in 2026, and a few other questions as well, which I think would have been interesting and still could. So if everyone would be happy with that, I'll send that out with a copy and the link to the video for this. Victoria, thank you very much for the time you've put into going through this. Appreciate all of you joining the webinar, and hopefully see you again soon. And it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Victoria. Thank you, Victoria.
Yeah. And if anyone has any sort of further questions, then my email address is there. So please feel free to contact me, and I can see if I can help.
Great. Thank you very much, all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.